when you look at the Nyingma Tantric literature, the Dzogchen literature, through ages, then you see the rise of also funerary applications of Dzogchen teachings. You see similar, practices similar to deity yoga and subtle body practices coming in as well. So can you talk about the evolution of these Dzogchen practices in bringing out inner Buddha nature? How have they changed from the 11th to the 14th century?
So from my perspective, and that's all I can really talk about, they have changed dramatically from the 11th century all the way up into the 21st century. The Dzogchen Nyingtik that we see in the 11th century is fundamentally and radically different from what we see with Longchenpa in the 14th century. And what we see with him is very, very different from what we see with, for example, Jigme Lingpa. And then there's many other traditions like the Yangti Nakpo, which I've been doing a lot of work on recently, that supposedly goes back to the 14th, 15th century with a guy named Dungso Repa, the elder, or the younger, and then continues into the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. That's also a very different tradition. So like there's so many different things that happen, but I'll give you just some of the highlights. The first one is when you look back at the 11th century and 12th century, and you look at the foundations of the Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition, it is profoundly oriented towards the senses and towards a kind of theology and practice of the material elements. Material elements meaning Sachu, Meilung, Namka, Sachu, earth, water, fire, wind, and then sometimes you add space as the fifth. Dzogchen Nyingtik in the 11th and 12th century is like fundamentally oriented around thinking about those material elements. The practices, the philosophical system, it goes on and on at great length about the elements. And it manifests in very particular ways, like in terms of practices. I mean, the Tugel practice 100% is there for sure, but there's all these other practices that work with your senses and material reality as a way to build a kind of meaningful contemplative life. Now, the most famous versions of those practices, which are known later on, are what are called the listening to the sounds of the four elements or five elements, 4 or 5. And that's this practice where later it gets talked about as a preliminary practice for the Tugel meditation, where essentially you go off into nature and you find naturally occurring forms of water and fire and wind and water and earth, and you listen to them. And you listen to them for like months on end. I mean, it's an incredibly immersive practice. And at some point, you begin to hear cosmological voices. Like in the sounds of those elements, you begin to hear the sounds of dakinis, of Buddhas, of demons, and all these other kinds of things. But those are not the only practices of material elements in the early Dzogchen Nyingtik tradition. You have practices about how do you taste the elements? How do you smell the elements? How do you touch the elements and so forth? And there's all these recipes. For example, there are recipes that tell you, hey, put this together with this, with this, with this, mix it up, bury it in the ground for 3 days, pull it out and smell it. And that's called, smelling the scent of the four elements. And then there's this whole complex philosophical system around the elements and how they work with time, how they relate to the changes of the seasons, the changes of time in a particular day, the changes of the years over the 12-year kind of calendar. And they also talk about bodies. Like everybody has a body of that's dominated by a certain element. So you can say, oh, I'm a yogi with a body of water, or she's a yogini with the body of fire. And depending upon which element dominates in your body, you're told to do different kinds of practices at different kinds of the day and so forth. And there's also just a lot of other orientation around our physical senses, not just our visual sense, which is what dominates later Dzogchen traditions, but our physical senses. So I spend a lot of my time back in those traditions, which I've really grown to love. And when I compare those to Longchenpa, which was really, what I spent all my 20s and 30s kind of studying primarily, and who I still love, I see it as being very, very different. Longchenpa has really fundamentally changed the tradition. And the thing about Longchenpa is you see everything that was there in the older tradition. Like I think of him as an encyclopedist. He doesn't leave anything out for the most part. Like he keeps stuff, but you can sense, at least I can sense, I do sense that it's not aligned with him. Like he doesn't have the same passion for the elements and for these sensory practices and so forth. Like his passions are elsewhere. And so even though the materials are still there, the passion and the interest has shifted register. I think he's much more focused on the Togel meditation and the Taikcha meditation, and a relatively slim set of preliminary practices that go hand in hand with it. He's much more focused on his vision of bodhicitta, of the enlightened mind, than he is of this kind of transformation of matter and the senses and so forth. So I just think it's a very different tradition, which it's taken me a long time to appreciate that. And I remember many years ago, I was studying these earlier texts, and I was talking to Ron Davidson, a well-known Tibetologist and Indologist of Tantric Buddhism. And he said, well, don't think that Longchenpa is saying the same thing as those 17 tantras, which were the canonical basis of Nyingtik in the 11th century. And it's a very obvious comment, because Longchenpa is 300 years later, and he's got his own agenda and so forth. But for me, it was a really important moment, because I thought, that's a good point, And so I started looking at those older traditions, not through the filter of Longchenpa, but in their own right. And then when we zoom forward to Jigme Lingpa, for example, to mention, probably the most famous Dzogchen figure in the last 3 centuries, it's just very, very different in character. What he's doing is so different from Longchenpa. He's much more interested in sadhanas and in deity yoga, and thinking about the possibilities of deity yoga as an individual and a collective practice, and how we could change those or transform those in relationship to kind of Dzogchen Nyingtik principles and so on. And he doesn't seem to have a whole lot of interest in the material theology or the material practices and the sensory practices. He very famously said, oh, even those sounds of the element practices, he says, like, oh, nobody does these anymore, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very different system. Like Longchenpa preserves everything, but when you get to Jigme Lingpa and you compare that to 11th, 12th century Nyingtik practices and thought systems, I mean, yes, there's continuity, but it's very, very different. And then when you zoom forward to Mipam, whose primary goal seems to be to work out this philosophical system in relationship to other Tibetan Buddhist sects, I mean, it's just, again, very, very different from the older traditions. That said, and we don't have time to get into this today, there are a lot of other diversity that's happening. And one of the things that's been very revelatory for me over the past couple of years is James Gentry and I started to decide, hey, let's review all of the dark retreat literature. Let's look at all the ways the Nyingma tradition worked with darkness as a contemplative practice for these visionary practices of Tugel. And that led us gradually to this Yangti Nakpo tradition, which is so different in character from these other Dzogchen traditions. And that's pretty late. We don't know how much of it goes back to the 15th century, but clearly it gets revived and so, re-revealed in the 19th and 20th century. And that's just a very different and very interesting twist. And I think there's many other stories to be told about how Dzogchen is just not one thing, even though in the last 30 or 40 years, I think our dominant ways of talking are to say, oh, this is what Dzogchen is. It's about Taikcha and Togel, and there's these preliminary practices that you do, like the Korde Rushen, the differentiation of samsara and nirvana, where you act crazily, and the sounds of the elements, and then these preliminaries of body, speech, and mind, where you visualize whoms in different ways and so forth. And that's all great, and that all goes back a long time, 1,000 years ago. But there's many other changes that happen over time.